We're going to learn about the skeletal system. So we're going to be going over lots of images from Wikipedia. We're going to first look at the overview of the skeletal system, how it looks like. This is the image I'm going to show you, and how it's broken down into appendicular and axial skeleton. And then we're going to look at each individual skeleton. So the skull, we're going to look at sternum, ribs, vertebrae. And then lastly, we're going to look at what types of bones there are. So first, we're going to look at how the bones are oriented. That's the important part when looking at the skeleton or whichever bones you're looking at, whether it's facing forward or backward or lateral. Forward is anterior, backward is posterior. So if you look at this image, you can see that the left image is facing forward. This is pretty obvious by how the skull is facing forward, by the eye sockets here, versus this one is facing backward. This is obvious by back of the head facing right here, and also scapula that's facing this way, which means that this view is posterior. So you have to orient yourself first. Let's take a look at the anterior view first. So we're going to look at the most top bone in our body, which is the skull. And it's broken down into cranium and mandible. And there are multiple bones in the skull, and way you can tell is by looking at these lines here, 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 here. These lines, there are more lines than that separate the skull into multiple bones. And it makes sense because your brain is encased here. So it has a very tight-knit bone structures that structure the brain inside this cranium area. That's what this is. So the next type of bones that we're going to look at are vertebrae. So vertebrae are this line of bones that creates your posture. So there are different types of vertebrae. We distinguish them by where they are located. So there are cervical vertebrae, which are located near the neck, so around this area. And then there are thoracic vertebrae, which are located where the ribs are located, so around this area. And then there are lumbar vertebrae, which is the bottom portion of your vertebrae. And then there are sacral, which is this part. And then lastly, there's coccyx. So this is cervical. And this rib area is thoracic. And this bottom area is lumbar. And the one underneath is sacral. And one underneath is coccyx. So vertebrae are very interesting. Even each cervical ones look different. Each thoracic one look kind of similar, but it may look a little different. Lumbar one looks different than thoracic or cervical. So you're gonna have to examine that individually to see what it looks like. Okay, so the next type of bones that we're going to look at are ribs. So ribs are located first thoracic vertebrae until the last thoracic vertebrae. And if you look at it, ribs start in the area where sternum is. So this is a sternum bone, and it has a connection directly to the sternum, and it rotates around the sternum and attach to the vertebrae. So the next type of bones we're going to look at are the sternum. So this is manubrium, this is the body, and this is the xiphoid process. So each is separated once again by this line. We don't really call it a separate bones, it just looks like there's three separate parts to the sternum. And the importance of that is attachment to the ribs in this area, and also protection of the heart, which is located on this side of the body. So it protects the heart, which is right underneath it. Okay, so the next group of bones that we're going to look at are called the pectoral girdles, which include the clavicle, which is most likely to be fractured, scapula underneath it, and humerus. Very long bone of the arm, which is right here. Next is if you go down the humerus, there is going to be two separate bones of the forearm, which is going to be radius right here and ulna right here. So the way to remember it is that radius is located on the thumb side of your arm versus your ulna is located on the pinky side. So if you look at your hand, what bone is located near the thumb side? It's going to be radius versus which bone is located on your pinky side is going to be ulna. And those two connect together right here with the humerus to form the elbow joint. It's mostly ulna forming it. The radius also plays a role in that. And another fun fact about radius, as you can see on this image versus this image, that it looks different. Why is that? It's because your radius, which is located right here, is still on the thumb side, can actually rotate around your arm to create this type of image. So the next type of bone we're going to look at are the carpals. So the carpals are located here. They're typically called the wrist bones. And there are multiple of them. And there are metacarpals here. And these are the phalanges right here. So if you look at the phalanges of the thumb, which is located right here, versus the phalanges of your other 4 digits, you realize that on thumb, there are 2 of them. 1, 2. If you look at the other one, there are 3. 1, 2, 3. So 2 phalanges and 3 phalanges. That's why your thumb is shorter than your other 4 digits. That's how you remember that. So the next group of bones that we're going to look at is the hip bone, they call it, or the pelvis. And it's broken down into 3 separate parts actually. So this is actually called the ilium, and this behind part right here is called ischium, and then this top part, front, is called a pubis. And then there is this long bone of the leg called femur. And underneath femur, there's patella. And underneath patella, there's tibia on the medial side of the body. And then there's fibula, which is on the lateral side of the body. So if you look at the difference between these 2 bones, it looks like tibia is much bigger than fibula. So the weight distribution is more on tibia compared to fibula. So let's look at the bones of the foot. So there are tarsals here, and in front of the tarsals there are metatarsals, and then there are phalanges. Pretty similar structure as the hand. But in the case of the foot, you're going to have to support the weight of the foot. There are specialized tarsals to support the weight. So there's going to be talus right here, which connects with the tibia and the fibula. And underneath the talus, there's going to be some bone called calcaneus. It's that bone of the foot that is kind of dense at the bottom. That's what the calcaneus is. So let's look at the posterior view this time, since we just look at the anterior view. So if you look at the posterior view, this is a skull again. And this time, the scapula is very defined right here. Scapula is very defined right here. And then the clavicle, you can barely see it. And then the humerus coming down. And then there's radius on the thumb side. And there's ulna on the pinky side. And you can see from this image that ulna makes up most of the elbow joint. So if you look at it here, ulna notches on to the humerus to create that elbow joint. Compared to radius, it's mostly just attaching to the humerus. And then there are these wrist bones located right here, and there are phalanges. So this is vertebrae. These are the ribs attaching to the vertebrae. As you can see, ribs attach directly to the vertebrae through this process. We come down here, there's pelvis right here, there are femur, and see how tibia takes up most of the femur. That means the most of the weight goes to tibia. And then there's fibula, tarsals here, metatarsals, and phalanges. Just like how we talked about, this is a talus bone that attaches to the tibia and fibula, and this is calcaneus, which takes up most of the weight of the body. We just went over the anterior and posterior view of the skeletal system, and we're going to go over the last photo on the right. So what does this mean? So this structure right here compared to these structures, this, are called differently. So this structure is called the axial skeleton, and these structures are called the appendicular skeleton. So think of it as 4 limbs plus the supporting bones of the limbs are the appendicular, versus the middle one that goes right down the middle around the vertebral column are called the axial skeleton, which makes sense. So the skull, vertebral column, and then the ribs are called the axial skeleton. And the only attachment point between the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton is between the sternum and the clavicle, which is located right here. That's the only area where the axial skeleton attaches with the appendicular skeleton directly.